The most important bathroom break in American crime history lasted exactly long enough for four men to fire 20 shots. April 15, 1931, Nuova Villa Tamaro, a quiet Italian restaurant in Coney Island, Brooklyn. The lunch crowd had thinned out by mid-afternoon, leaving only a handful of diners enjoying the spring weather and excellent food. At a corner table sat two men, Joe the boss Masseria, one of the most powerful crime bosses in New York, and his trusted lieutenant, Charles Lucky Luciano. They'd finished a leisurely meal of seafood and pasta, drank wine, and were now playing cards while digesting. It looked like a pleasant afternoon between a boss and his loyal subordinate, but in the kitchen a different story was being written, because Lucky Luciano had planned this lunch very carefully. The location, the timing. No excuse he would need, and most importantly, what would happen when he stood up, excused himself politely, and walked to the bathroom, leaving his boss alone at the table. 20 shots later, Joe Masseria would be dead, and Lucky Luciano would have the perfect alibi. I was in the bathroom. I don't know what happened. It was the lie everyone knew was a lie, and the truth no one could prove. But the real story was never only about the murder. To understand why this assassination mattered, you need to understand the Castle Amherst War. For 2 years, from 1929 to 1931, New York's Italian underworld had been tearing itself apart in a brutal conflict between Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Both were old guard Sicilian bosses who believed in traditional hierarchies, ethnic purity, and power maintained through violence and respect. They were fighting for supremacy in the Italian criminal world, and dozens of men had died in the crossfire. Luciano was caught in the middle. He worked for Masseria, but he was frustrated by the old boss's inability to see beyond old-world thinking. Masseria refused to work with non-Italians, rejected modern business methods, and seemed more interested in fighting wars than making money. Meanwhile, Maranzano was even worse, styling himself as a modern Caesar, organizing crime families like Roman legions and demanding absolute obedience. Both men represented everything Luciano wanted to leave behind: the ethnic divisions, the territorial thinking, the endless violence that brought police attention and destroyed profitability. Luciano had a vision for organized crime that transcended both Masseria and Maranzano, but he couldn't build that vision while the war raged on. Someone had to end it, and since neither boss would back down, that meant someone had to die. Luciano decided it would be Masseria, not out of personal hatred, but because removing Masseria was the strategic move that would end the war and create space for something new. What happened next changed the meaning of everything that came before. The planning was meticulous. Luciano couldn't kill Masseria himself. That would be too obvious and would violate every code of loyalty the underworld respected. He needed plausible deniability. He needed to be present but not involved, visible but not culpable. And most importantly, he needed witnesses who could testify he wasn't the shooter, even if everyone suspected he orchestrated it. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Have lunch with Masseria in a public restaurant. Establish presence. Then create an excuse to be absent for the crucial moments. Let others do the actual killing. Return and express shock. The alibi wasn't about being somewhere else entirely. It was about being close enough to be present but far enough to claim innocence. April 15, 1931 was a beautiful spring day. Luciano suggested lunch at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a restaurant in Coney Island that Masseria considered safe territory. They arrived in the early afternoon, were seated at a quiet table, and proceeded to enjoy an excellent meal. The restaurant owner, Gerardo Scarpato, served them personally. Other diners were present, but at a distance. Everything appeared normal, pleasant, routine. After the meal, they ordered wine and started playing cards. Masseria was relaxed, unguarded, enjoying the afternoon with a lieutenant he trusted. Why wouldn't he? Luciano had been loyal, effective, and profitable. There was no reason to suspect anything unusual about this lunch. Around 3:30 p.m., Luciano excused himself. He needed to use the restroom, perfectly natural after a long meal. He stood, walked away from the table, and disappeared into the back of the restaurant. And then four men walked in. The confidence in his presence did not mean certainty existed within him. The gunmen were professionals. They knew exactly what they were doing. They entered the restaurant, likely through the kitchen to avoid attention from the dining room. They moved quickly to Masseria's table. He looked up, probably surprised but not immediately alarmed. Armed men were common in his world. By the time he understood what was happening, it was too late. 20 shots, multiple guns firing simultaneously. Accounts vary on exact details. Some say it was 4 gunmen, some say 5. The identities were never officially confirmed, though underworld legend names Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy sigil as the shooters. What's certain is that Joe Masseria died at that table, slumped over the cards he'd been playing, 20 bullet wounds in his body. The shooting lasted seconds. The gunmen fled immediately, likely through the same route they'd entered. By the time anyone could react, they were gone, and when the smoke cleared and the ringing in ears faded, Lucky Luciano emerged from the bathroom, looked at the scene, and reportedly said, "I was in the bathroom. What happened? It was the perfect alibi, and everyone knew it was a lie, but there was something no one around him could fully understand. The beauty of the alibi wasn't its believability, it was its unprovability. The police knew Luciano had orchestrated the hit. The underworld knew he'd betrayed his boss. Even Luciano's own associates knew exactly what had happened. But none of that mattered because they couldn't prove it in court. Luciano was present in the restaurant. Witnesses confirmed that. He was having lunch with Masseria. Witnesses confirmed that. He went to the bathroom shortly before the shooting. Witnesses confirmed that. He emerged after the shooting expressing confusion. Witnesses confirmed that. Could they prove he knew the gunmen were coming? No. Could they prove he'd coordinated with them? No. Could they prove anything beyond the fact that he'd unfortunately been in the bathroom when his boss was murdered? No. The police tried every angle. They questioned the restaurant staff. They investigated the gunmen's identities. They looked for connections between Luciano and potential shooters. They analyzed the timing. They interviewed witnesses from the street outside, but every lead went nowhere. The staff saw nothing. The gunmen vanished. The witnesses were unreliable, and the timing, however suspicious, proved nothing. One detective reportedly told Luciano during questioning, "We know you set this up." Luciano's response was simple, "Prove it." That exchange captured the entire dynamic: knowledge without evidence, certainty without proof, the perfect crime existing in the space between what everyone knows and what anyone can demonstrate in court. The restaurant owner, Gerardo Scarpato, would later be found murdered himself, killed for allowing his restaurant to be used for the hit, or possibly because he knew too much about the planning. But even that murder didn't produce evidence against Luciano. The gunmen were never identified officially. No one testified about coordination or planning. The murder remained technically unsolved, though everyone knew who was behind it. And Luciano understood something crucial. In criminal justice, everyone knowing you're guilty means nothing if they can't prove it in court. He built a world that looked controlled, even while carrying burdens no one could see. The aftermath moved quickly. With Masseria dead, the Castellammer's war was effectively over. Salvatore Maranzano declared victory and called a meeting of all Italian gangsters in New York. He announced a new structure. He would be boss of bosses, with families organized beneath him in a rigid hierarchy modeled on the Roman Empire. Luciano and other young gangsters attended, outwardly accepting the new order. But Luciano hadn't killed Masseria just to replace him with another dictator. He'd killed Masseria to clear the board for something different, and Maranzano, despite his victory, didn't understand that he was next. 5 months after Masseria's murder, on September 10, 1931, Salvatore Maranzano was killed in his office by men dressed as police officers. And when that smoke cleared, Lucky Luciano stood at the center of a transformed underworld. Not as boss of bosses, he rejected that title. Instead, he created the Commission, a governing body where multiple families shared power, coordinated operations, and resolved disputes through negotiation rather than warfare. The Masseria murder was the first domino. The Maranzano murder was the second, and the Commission was what emerged when both old guard bosses were eliminated and young gangsters finally had space to implement their vision of modern organized crime. The bathroom alibi became legendary. It was so obvious, so transparent, so clearly a coordinated execution disguised as random violence. But it worked. Luciano was never charged with Masseria's murder, never even seriously investigated. The perfect crime wasn't about having a believable story, it was about having a story they couldn't disprove. What people called legendary often began as something deeply personal. The murder itself demonstrated Luciano's strategic thinking. He could have had Masseria killed anywhere, anytime. A car bombing, a drive-by shooting, an ambush on a dark street, but those approaches carried risk. Witnesses might see Luciano's involvement. evidence might connect him to the planning. And most importantly, those methods looked like betrayal. By being present during the murder, having lunch with Masseria like a loyal subordinate, Luciano created a different narrative. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't skulking in shadows plotting his boss's death. He was there, visible, going about normal business. The murder happened around him, not because of him, at least that's what the alibi suggested. And the bathroom excuse was brilliant because it was so mundane. He wasn't claiming to be across town with witnesses. He wasn't presenting an elaborate alternative timeline. He was just saying he'd been in the bathroom for a few minutes. Perfectly normal, perfectly believable as an action, perfectly suspicious as a coincidence, but impossible to disprove. The police interviewed Luciano multiple times after the murder. They knew what had happened, but every question got the same answer. I was in the bathroom. I don't know what happened. I heard shots, came out and found him dead. I don't know who did it. What could they charge him with? Being in a bathroom, having lunch with someone who got killed. They had no physical evidence placing him with the gunmen, no witnesses testifying to coordination, no paper trail of planning, just the obvious fact that the timing was too convenient to be coincidence. But convenient timing isn't evidence, and in American criminal justice, suspicion without evidence means freedom. The image was real, so was the silence afterward. The Masseria murder became a template for how sophisticated criminals eliminate rivals while maintaining plausible deniability. Be present but not involved. Create alibis that are obviously false, but technically unprovable. Let subordinates do the actual killing. Express appropriate shock afterward, and most importantly, never talk about it. Luciano never admitted to orchestrating Masseria's murder. Not in the decades that followed, not in conversations with associates, not even in his final years in exile. The official story remained: he was in the bathroom, he heard shots, he came out to find his boss dead. Did anyone believe it? No. Could anyone prove otherwise? Also know that discipline, the refusal to confirm what everyone already knew, was crucial to Luciano's success. Many gangsters got caught because they bragged about their crimes, confirmed suspicions to impress others, or let ego override caution. Luciano understood that the perfect crime stays perfect only if you never admit it was a crime. The murder also demonstrated Luciano's understanding of power dynamics. He couldn't openly challenge Masseria, that would have meant war, and Luciano didn't have the muscle to win that war at the time. But he could remove Masseria in a way that looked like someone else's doing, position himself as a loyal lieutenant who was present but uninvolved, and then work with whoever filled the power vacuum. When Maranzano declared himself boss of bosses after Masseria's death, Luciano appeared to accept it. He attended the meetings, showed respect, and played the role of dutiful subordinate, all while planning Maranzano's elimination. Because the lesson of the Masseria murder was clear: you don't have to beat your enemies in direct confrontation. You just have to be smarter, more patient, and willing to strike when they're vulnerable. Many knew the legend: the boss murdered while his lieutenant was in the bathroom. The 20 shots that killed Joe Masseria and ended the Castellammer's war. The alibi everyone knew was false, but no one could disprove. But very few understood the hunger that built it. The strategic mind that saw opportunity in violence, the patience to plan meticulously, the discipline to execute perfectly, and the understanding that the best crimes leave no prosecutable evidence, only suspicious coincidences. That hunger came from somewhere much deeper, from watching the Castellammer's war waste lives and money on pointless territorial disputes, from understanding that the old bosses would never stop fighting unless someone stopped them permanently, from recognizing that sometimes the only way to build something new is to destroy what exists, but you have to destroy it in a way that doesn't destroy you in the process. The real story was never only about Joe Masseria's murder. It was about what that murder represented: the end of old-world thinking in American organized crime, the elimination of bosses who couldn't adapt to modern business methods, the clearing of space for a new generation to implement their vision. And most importantly, the demonstration that calculated violence, properly executed with plausible deniability, could change history without leaving prosecutable evidence. Lucky Luciano learned from the Masseria murder. He applied those lessons when eliminating Maranzano 5 months later, and he carried that strategic understanding through his entire criminal career. Be present but deniable, be obvious but unprovable, and never, ever admit what everyone already knows. The bathroom alibi became one of the most famous lies in American crime. History not because it was believable, but because it was perfect. And in that perfection, the transparent implausibility that couldn't be legally challenged, Lucky Luciano demonstrated the difference between being suspected and being convicted, between everyone knowing you're guilty and anyone being able to prove it. Joe Masseria died at a restaurant table, 20 bullets in his body, while his most trusted lieutenant was conveniently in the bathroom. The Castle Amherst War ended that day. The old guard lost their last major boss, and Lucky Luciano walked out of that restaurant a free man, his hands technically clean, his conscience unburdened by the weight of proof. Because in the end, the perfect crime isn't about having no one suspect you. It's about having everyone suspect you and no one being able to do anything about it. Lucky Luciano understood that. He proved it with 20 shots and one bathroom break, and he never faced consequences for what might be the most important murder in American organized crime history. The bathroom door closed, the shots rang out, the boss died, the lieutenant emerged, and the perfect alibi lived forever.